أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المظلومين صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة العمة يا غريب يا مذنوم يا أتشان كربلاء ما خاب من تمسك بكم والعمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم والقول كالحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يتفكرون. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على Muhammad. The human being has been able to accomplish some truly incredible things. In the course of just this past century, the human being has reached the moon, has been able to make such strides in technology and civilization to create the internet, to allow for us to connect with people on the opposite side of the world, literally with a couple of presses of buttons on this mobile device known as our iPhones. This incredible sort of strides that the human being has made demonstrates a great deal about our potential and about our capacity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with an intellect, and that through experiences and the molding of everything that it is that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, truly we have to make strides and continue to make strides during the course of life. We've been able to solve challenges and obstacles that maybe hundreds of years ago they would have never thought that we'd be able to actually reach and culminate into. But today, again, like I said before, if you just reflect back to 30 years ago or 20 years ago, or if I reflect back to when I was even in college, if someone were to tell me that I can give you a book and that within this book there's going to be 1,000 books, and you can make the font bigger or the font smaller, or you could make it really, really bright, the text, or make it really, really dark. That this book, you could read it horizontally, or you could read it vertically. And within that book, again, you have, tens of thousands of different pieces of literature. You'd probably laugh at them and say, what are you talking about? But now, today, we know that we have the iPad. That civilization and technology makes such strides that when we hear about a lot of the traditions that we spoke about in regards to the end of times, for instance, a couple of nights ago, we begin to realize that really anything is possible with this human being and with technology, with the intellect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us and has blessed us with. And although we've been able to solve so much of the deficiencies and of the difficulties that human beings often have to go through, amongst those things that we have not been able to solve from the beginning of time is in regards to how we should balance our relationships, which is why that there are books upon encyclopedias, articles, TV shows, movies dedicated to, for instance, how you should live with your spouse, or how you should engage someone who has a completely different upbringing than you. In fact, sometimes we see that the majority of TV and popular culture often engages making a mockery or sarcasm or jokes about the challenges that we engage with when it comes to our relationships, that of our spouse, that of our parents, that of our in-laws, that of our children. relationships are something that are really, really difficult. They're really challenging. And when you sort of take a step back and you begin to kind of think about everything else that we've been able to do, we've been able to reach the moon. We can't figure out how to live with our life. How does that even make any sense? You realize that obstacles and hurdles when it comes toward building out a relationship are some things that are very real, and that managing a relationship, again, like that with your spouse, or that with your children, or that with your roommate, or that with your siblings, or that with your in-laws, or whatever it might be, contains so many obstacles and challenges, many times because of where we are situated within our own hearts and within our own souls. What I mean is that we don't necessarily have such a firm grounding in terms of how we navigate other human beings. People are different. They come from different backgrounds. They come from different cultures. They come and they have different experiences. Even individuals who grew up together exactly the same way. If you have twins, for instance, in your family, or you know others, that they grow up with obviously the same parents. They grow up with probably very, very similar experiences. Even when they're young, they get mistaken for the same person many a time. They go often to the same school. They have the same educational sort of upbringing, but naturally, they're very different personalities because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously created us all in a very unique way. Thus, understanding, first of all, that relationships are difficult and they're very challenging to navigate through is of the utmost importance. And we're unable to really solve the obstacles and challenges that we engage in when it comes toward our relationships if we don't submit to the fact that it requires a lot of effort and that it requires a lot of work. And for today's discussion, inshallah, I want to reflect upon many of the contemporary challenges when it comes to relationships that we face within our communities today. Partly the inspiration for me to talk about this subject, when most of you know that I prefer to probably talk about issues in regards to theology, in regards to ethics and spirituality, is because there is a really sort of glaring need to talk about very social issues within our communities and oftentimes utilize the biggest platforms to do so. So because of my awareness that we are in the middle of the nights, or the first 10 nights of Muharram, and that these are the nights of Majalis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, which often grasp unique individuals from all across the community to attend and participate in these programs, it's vital for us to call out those very difficult challenges that we're consistently seeing and hopefully find a way and a means toward reconciling them by applying the wisdoms as we learn from the Holy Quran and from the teachings of the Messenger of God, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wassalam. And so I want to reflect upon this conversation around contemporary relationship challenges in 3 different dimensions. The first dimension of my conversation is to talk about the foundational principles of relationships as taught to us within the Holy Quran and direct teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wassalam. In other words, what do the Quran and the Prophet and his family speak to in regards to how we should live our lives and manage our relationships? Secondly, what are the contemporary problems that are sort of very common during the course of these days? And the third dimension of the discussion, in regards to specific points to consider in terms of building out a successful relationship according to the guidance of the Prophet and his family, alayhimu salatu wassalam. So let's get straight into the foundational principles of relationships within Islamic tradition. Again, understanding that the Holy Quran, the Prophet and his family, alayhimu salam, they've given us sort of the groundwork and the foundation by which we should start to build our lives. And that we recognize that they have given us the tools, but it's up to the believer to implement those tools. And if we choose to look at the tools and we choose to see how attractive that they might be, and we see that they're really nice, colorful. For instance, if you go to Home Depot and you see all of these tools on the wall, and you see, look at this hammer, it looks really, really nice. It has a red handle. That's great if it has a red handle. But if at the end of the day you're like me, you have no idea how to use a hammer, what difference does it make? Other than the fact that it has a really nice, attractive red handle to it. We have to go beyond what we see on the surface, again, as I've been mentioning sort of time and time again, and utilize what we have and striving to the best of our abilities toward actually implementing them. So I love the Quran because I like its recitation. Especially I like when Qari Zuhair recites Quran. He has a really beautiful voice. But do I only listen to the Quran because I like how he sounds and I like how he recites? Or do I like the ayat that he's speaking to? And am I striving toward implementing the verses and the meaning of the Quran that I have in front of me? That's two very, very different things. And again, when we talk about the fact that the Quran and the Messenger and his family have given us the foundation is present, but it's up to us to take those tools once again and implement them. And so for the sake of our conversation this evening, inshaAllah ta'ala, I want to reflect upon specifically 5 foundational principles that the Quran and Ahlul Bayt offer us in terms of how we should live our lives and manage our relationships. The first one of these comes from the advice of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam, in virtually what he advises that the human being should be what they want to see. And let me just take one step back and say that relationships don't only mean between husband and wife. A lot of times, people, they often jump straight towards sort of spousal or marital relationships when we're talking about a conversation like this. But we know that right now we live in a really strange time. The world of COVID-19, this pandemic that we're currently undergoing. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remove these difficulties from all of us very soon, inshaAllah ta'ala. And we see that marital relationships, of course, go through unique challenges during the course of these days, as numbers around domestic violence cases here in New York City and across the country, they slowly start to increase because of how difficult it might be to navigate or for people to sort of have that separation. So challenges around domestic violence have certainly increased. But at the same time, you live with roommates. In New York City, many times people, they reach out and they say, how exactly am I going to navigate my relationship with my roommate who I don't necessarily get along with, but now I've been with him or her for the last 5 or 6 months? Or sometimes because you see only your family every single day. You only see your parents, you only see your children, you only see your in-laws, you only see your brother, your sister who you might live with, or the only people you actually can trust to go and spend time with because of social distancing rules and policies and so on and so forth and precautions, that sometimes you realize that, man, I need to have a little bit of distance, and how exactly am I to navigate all of these relationships? So again, we go back and we understand that the principles that we're outlining this evening, as taught to us by the Quran and by Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, are not solely limited toward marital relationships, but relationships all across the world. So number 1, the foundational principle offered to us by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib is be what you want to see. When the Imam alayhi salam states in his famous narration, خَالَتُ النَّاسِ مُخَالَطَةً إِن مِتُّم مَّعَهَا بَكَوْا عَلَيْكُمْ وَإِنْ عِشْتُمْ حَنُّوا إِلَيْكُمْ. He says, live amongst people in such a way that if you die, they weep over you. And if you are alive, they crave your company. Really, these are words to live by the commander of the faithful, salamullah alayhi. These are amongst the most important words of wisdom that we have within our lives and within our tradition. Live amongst people in such a way that if you die, they weep over you. Be that which you want others to be. And if you're present, they crave your company. And that's difficult all the time. We'll talk about that in a little while. But if we had that opportunity to ask ourselves the question, what is the ideal etiquette of how I should live my life? What better advice and words of wisdom than that of the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wasalam. Live amongst people in such a way that if you die, they crave your company. Because you left behind a legacy. You bring solace and comfort to their hearts. They enjoy being in your presence. And when you're not in their presence, they crave to be in your company. Salamullah ala amir. A second foundational principle that we learn, in addition to be what you want to see, is to be in a state of expressing your love to others. Now, not only love in terms of intimacy, but rather love in terms of all of its different variations and manifestations. We see that the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would consistently, openly, and often demonstrate his love for Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salatu wasalam, to the extent that he was honoring her, of course, not only because she's his daughter, but also because she's Sayyidatun Nisa al-Alameen, that when she would walk into the room, the Messenger of God would stand up out of love, and out of honor, and out of respect for his daughter al-Zahra. That Imams al-Hasan and al-Hussein, like we know and that we spoke about a couple of nights ago, they would ride upon the back of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then the Prophet would call out that, "Oh Allah, bear witness that I love these two children, and I love those who love these two children." What was the reason why the Prophet had to say that loudly? He could have said it quietly. He could have said while Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam was sitting on his shoulder, "Oh Allah, know that I love this son of mine, this grandson of mine, and I love whoever loves this grandson of mine." Because he also wanted them to hear. It's important that we tell our children, especially at a very young age, that we love them, that we care about them, so that they know, so they have that comfort, so they have that confidence when they get older, that they have their parents supporting them and truly love them from the depth of their heart and are open toward expressing that emotion to them. Thirdly, what do we find? In addition to being that which we want to see from others, and in addition to expressing our love openly and as often as we possibly can, recognize the importance of the foundational principle of mercy within our tradition. Of course, we know, and we'll talk about that in a couple of nights, inshallah, about the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, specifically when it comes to the relationships that we engage with others. We see that in the Arabic language, the word for mercy is rahma, like we know, coming from the root word rahima. And the womb in the Arabic language is known as rahim as well, which is why the commandment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep good ties with members of our family is known as silatul rahim or silatul arham, to keep kinship bonds. And it comes from that root word of mercy, because it means that we have to emanate mercy toward our brothers, toward our cousins, toward our aunts, towards our uncles, anyone who shares this womb with us, anyone who is a direct family member of you. And it doesn't mean that necessarily you have to have the best of relationships with those people, but it means that you have to have mercy upon them, even if it means you make dua for them, if it's difficult for you to speak to them. Or you send a text message once in a while, you make a phone call once in a while. You do the small things to the best of your ability toward emanating that mercy toward family members around you. Fourthly and finally, from amongst those foundational principles, and the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has demonstrated to how we should engage in terms of relationships with others, is the importance of understanding that people come from different backgrounds and the end goal is to know one another. As we know in that famous ayah of the whole Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهِ يَتَقَاكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us in the diversity that He has created us, with the hope and with the aspiration that we come to know one another. Not that we come to segregate from one another, that we come to know one another. So when two people come from completely different parts of the world, or from different families, they have different baggages, they have different experiences, naturally it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes that command, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you can come to learn and know about one another. And that through this drawing of closeness between two people, either in marriage or in friendship or in community, is meant to take us to the next and ultimate and final objective, which is closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is why God states in the verse, He continues and He states, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The best amongst you are those who have taqwa in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who have God consciousness, who feel the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, not so that we differentiate. God created us different. He He created us with this diversity so that we're able to appreciate the diversity that we see, and it allows for us to draw closer to our Creator. Which is why it's sad, it's challenging, it's really sort of hurtful that today we see it all the time, that there are communities and there are families and there are people who will openly segregate when it comes toward matters of culture, specifically in matters of marriage. And they will say that, for instance, you cannot marry my daughter or you cannot marry my son because you come from a different culture. Or even worse, because you come from a different part of the same country that we come from. Or because you speak a different dialect. Or because you like to eat this type of food versus that type of food. At the end of the day, of course, the individuals, they themselves have the right to choose who they want to marry. Let me just say this really, really quickly. I wasn't intending to, but it's super important for me to make mention of it today. That today in our communities, many a time, we have family members or community leaders who will tell others not to marry this man or this woman because they are too tall for you, they are too short for you, they are too dark for you, they are too light for you in terms of their skin complexion. Can you believe it? These are real problems that consistently and continually inflict disaster in our communities, in our families, every single day, every single day. Yeah, how divorced are we from the ethos and the etiquette that we learned from the Messenger of God, Muhammad and Ahlul Bayt. How embarrassing is this? How embarrassing is this? It's absurd to think that these sorts of practices in this part of the world, they still continue. This is committing a sin on behalf of those who actually allow and facilitate and actually encourage that people from different parts of the world or who look different should not marry one another, especially when they choose and they want to. No one should stop them, of course, assuming that all of the other prerequisites are met. Deen wa khuluq, as we mentioned a couple of nights ago in our lecture on istikhara, that if they have good faith and they're sort of equivalent with one another, they suffice one another, then it should be okay. But again, the reason why we see challenges in our relationships is because we create barriers for ourselves and we step away from the teachings and the sort of, essence of that which the Quran and Ahlul Bayt have offered us. So as a quick summary, amongst those most important steps that we need to consistently be emanating if we want to have successful relationships maritally, in terms of friendships, with family members, is number one, be what you want to see. Live amongst people in such a way that if you die, they weep over you, and if you're alive, they crave your company. Number two, emanate mercy and understand that at the very least, send a message once in a while. Start with mercy and compassion and don't jump to conclusions. Inna ba'da dhanni. Number three, express your love when you have the opportunity to do so. Because people appreciate when you tell them that you love them and that you care about them. Number four, understand that relationships are difficult, but it's important to understand that diversity is something beautiful and it's meant to be something difficult, but it's also meant to be something that unveils and uncovers unique realities of that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends. And fifthly and finally, understand that relationships at the end of the day are a journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this is important because in verse number 30, or chapter number 30, verse number 21, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to the verse that we often recite at weddings during times of marriage, in which God states, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. In chapter number 30, verse number 21, God states, and from amongst God's signs, أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, that from amongst God's signs, He has created from amongst you spouses. And if you take a look at the verses that precede chapter 30, verse 21, verses 20, verses 19, and the verses that come after that, verses 22 and verses number 23, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about His signs. He talks about His signs as the creation of the heavens and the earth, He talks about his signs, about how he created the human being from dust. From amongst his signs, he says that he created you with different languages and different skin colors. That all of these unique signs that God created are meant to be a means that take us to our ultimate destination. A sign is meant to take us to our destination. When we're driving on the highway, we see a sign, we know that this sign is going to take us to the town, to the city, to the area, to the region, to wherever it is that we need to go. Similarly, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the sun, the moon, the stars, the fact that he created you from nothing are all signs, it's meant to take us to our ultimate destination, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. And in this ayah, he states, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, and from amongst his signs, أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, and from amongst his signs is that he has created from amongst you spouses. That marriage in and of itself, and if you could sort of broaden it toward understanding that all relationships are meant to be a means by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tries us. Many of you might be familiar with the incredible work of Imam Ali ibn Hussein Sajjad, Zayn al-Abidin salamullahi alayhi, Risalat al-Huquq, which is a very early work that we find within the school of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salatu wasalam, though there's a lot of conversation and many doubts that are often presented in regards to the reliability of Risalat al-Huquq. That's for another conversation. Nonetheless, because of how early it is, we can absolutely ascertain and take unique wisdoms from it. And if we're to give the benefit of the doubt that these are the words of Imam Ali ibn Hussein Zayn al-Abidin, salamullahi alayhi, what we see is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created relationships that have certain responsibilities. So within this doctrine, within these treaties of rights of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam talks about the relationship that you have with your spouse, with your father, with your mother, with your children, with your brother, so on and so forth. And oftentimes you will remember about the importance of being God conscious in the midst of the relationship. Because again, at the end of this all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to test us and going to try us by how we navigate different and difficult relationships during the course of our lives. And if we understand these 5 foundational principles, be what you want to see, express your love, have mercy upon one another, understanding that it's difficult, but one has to strive to know one another, and fifthly and finally, that everything that we do, everyone that we interact with, is an opportunity and a journey toward getting closer toward God, then we'll be able to make those necessary strides and combat all of the social ills, obstacles, and challenges that we find within many contemporary relationships. And then that brings me thus to our second dimension of the discussion, in regards to maybe what are some of these contemporary problems that our communities face. I'll try to run through them very briefly so we can get to the final point of our conversation in regards to those points to consider in order to build these healthy and successful relationships. Amongst the contemporary problems that we are currently engaging in, as I mentioned before, is the fact that we create barriers for ourselves many a time based on what we believe to be is right, as opposed to utilizing what we have in terms of the wisdoms and the foundational principles offered to us by Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salatu wasalam. And these challenges have become exasperated over the last 5 or 6 months because for many people, they've never been so challenged in their relationship because they're consistently with people who are so close to them all the time, and might become a little bit more difficult and challenging to do so in light of the circumstances that we're living in. So for someone, for instance, who is newly married in the last 6 months or in the last year, or even in the last 2 years, you know that the first several years or the first several months of marriage come with their own unique challenges. And all of a sudden now you're living with your spouse and you used to go to work and she used to go to work and used to come back home and used to eat, used to go to sleep, and the next day you would have the same routine. And the only times where you actually spend elongated periods of time, 24, 36, 48 hours with one another consecutively, was on the weekend. But on the weekend, you had the opportunity to go to restaurants, you had the opportunity to go to the mall, you had the opportunity to go and see things, go visit the museum, God knows what, whatever it is that you do. And now all of a sudden, everything shut down. So now how exactly am I going to navigate this relationship with this person who comes from a completely different walk of life from me, who for the last 25 or 30 years grew up with his or her family or their own sort of life experiences, and now I'm expected to all of a sudden live my entire life with this person 24/7? What am I supposed to do? Again, it goes back to the fundamental problem that we find within our communities in regards toward the biggest challenges that we find in contemporary relationships, the inability to openly communicate with one another. Because a lot of times people, they feel that all of their problems will just go away. Of course, for many people, oftentimes they just do go away because you learn how to navigate, you learn how to mold, you learn how to balance things, you learn how to just forget certain things and never bring them up ever again. But that becomes a little bit more difficult when you're consistently in each other's faces. But again, this doesn't only have to do with, husband and wife. It could be between parents and children, children and parents. It could be between, in-laws, for instance. It could be between a whole host of different, types of relationships, siblings, for instance, roommates. The inability to communicate is a really serious problem and difficulty and challenge. And we see that perhaps the biggest reason for why we have these challenges today is because we're so sort of comfortable texting with individuals or communicating with others via social media and not having real conversations face to face. I have people sitting in my office every single day of the week, oftentimes trying to navigate a relationship difficulty or challenge that they have either with their father or with their mother or with their spouse or with their significant other or with their child or with their friend or whatever it might be. And oftentimes, the biggest reason why they're sitting in my office is because they feel that their friend or their spouse or the person that they're having this relationship with doesn't understand them. When you bring part number 2 into that office and you try to have this conversation with them, what we begin to realize is that there's such a lack of understanding about how to talk to one another because the majority of one's conversation is via a text message conversation. And so it's very difficult to express emotion when your entire life you've been communicating with them via text. And how difficult is it then to have difficult conversations and challenging conversations? Because when there's a very real problem, you're not ready to talk about it face to face. You're a lot more comfortable to just text or just send an email. And so the biggest reason why we have challenges in our relationships many a times, and of course it's not always the case, but the majority of the time, from at least that which I'm seeing from amongst many different sort of examples and sort of anecdotes, is this inability to communicate due to a stress on texts and not real conversation. And that brings me then to number 2, which is, like I mentioned before, just ignoring the problem entirely and this assumption that everything is going to eradicate itself and miraculously go away. And you think that, that's not, how could anyone actually believe that? But many times we can live our life for many years assuming that everything will get better until we realize, oh no, it's not going to get better. I liken it to this example. That if you understand and you realize that you're eating unhealthy every single day, many times people, they just assume and they believe that I'm eventually going to get it, right? I have to get it eventually. I'm not always going to be obsessed with eating cheesecake, for instance. So you eat that cheesecake and then you eat it again tomorrow, and then you eat it the day after, and then you say, okay, I'm not gonna eat it every day, I'm just gonna eat it 5 days a week. And you realize that you just are sort of coasting through life, not taking your physical health seriously, with the assumption that one day it's going to all get a lot better. And then you become 30 years old, and you become 35, and you become 40, you go to the doctor, and the doctor says you should stop doing this, and you say, yes, I promise I'm gonna stop doing it. Then all of a sudden, you realize that you've wasted 50 years, 60 years of your life not taking your physical health seriously because of your assumption that it was just going to miraculously fix itself. So you like the idea of eating healthy and of stopping to eat cheesecake or whatever other sweet that you fancy. But at the end of the day, to actually stop it and to fix it is actually not so easy, is it? It's very challenging, it's very difficult. Relationships are exactly the same. It's never going to get better if you don't want it to get better, or if you assume that everything is going to get better miraculously on its own. Rather, you have to understand that it's very difficult and it's very challenging, and that it requires a sense of ownership, and it requires you to admit to yourself that I'm not perfect, and that I am making mistakes, and that now I can start to improve and work on them. And you have to actually start to work on them. You just can't assume that now, once I've made the intention to, that all of a sudden everything is going to get better. So problem number 2, in addition to an inability to communicate, is to ignore problems entirely and assume that everything is going to miraculously disappear. Amongst those contemporary relationship obstacles and challenges that we have is an inability to keep problems to ourselves. That we live in a world where it's oftentimes all about our own self-glorification. We live in a world that's always about social media. We live in a culture of the selfie. You take a photo, you post it to get as many likes or retweets as possible, because you want to show people that you look really, really nice today. Alhamdulillah. All of you are very, very beautiful. Of course, I do not see anyone right now. That's why I'm telling you all that right now. Of course, this is another bad joke, because it gets really, really lonely talking to myself in front of the computer for 1 hour. But I'm trying my best over here, so please forgive me and my terrible sarcasm and jokes. I should probably just continue. Okay, so when we talk about this life that we live and this sort of instant gratification and self-glorification that we engage in during the course of our lives, so many times we are ready to just project ourselves to anyone and to everyone. And we want to tell everyone when we're having a good day. We want to tell everyone when we're having a bad day. We want to tell everyone, what we ate for breakfast, and what we ate for lunch, and what we ate for dinner, and what we ate in between, and what we thought about eating, for instance, in the middle of the night, God knows what. We want to tell everyone about our lives all the time, consistently. You get the point. But oftentimes when it comes toward relationships, and when it comes toward challenges, we see that amongst those biggest issues that we see on a day-to-day basis is an inability to keep problems between 2 parties or 3 parties or the parties involved because of our necessity to just consistently share and project our problems to everyone else, many times because we want validation during the course of our lives. Of course, I'm not talking about anyone in specific, but I'm talking about generally. That many times that we have to share every single argument that we get into with our brother, with our sister, with our mom, with our in-law, with our spouse, with our children, to all of our friends. What's the need for that? What's the necessity to do just that? Or even worse, would actually go and post it on social media by some sort of cryptic tweet. You don't need to do that. It's not going to serve you any good. And especially for young people, many a times when they're in their engagement period, so to say, or, leading up to the marriage, oftentimes they share every single obstacle, and every single argument, and every single challenge with their parents. Look, there's no need to do that. If you understand that at the end of the day, the success of a relationship is between person A and person B, and that you're going to go through hardships, that you're going to go through difficulties, then at the end of the day, you will be able to fix it and you will be able to overcome those difficulties and challenges. Of course, I'm not saying entirely you should never share problems with other people. Don't get me wrong. Many of you have attended my majalis over the last several years. We've given several talks around the importance of mental health, around the importance of sort of venting, and the importance of mentorship, and the importance of seeing professionals when you need to. And many of you who I know may have sat in my office in the past, but made specific recommendations to go and seek professional help and share those experiences in order to rectify the problems. But I'm speaking sort of on a general, spectrum. And many times those difficulties and those obstacles and those challenges, they do not necessitate publicizing your problems to the whole entire world. They are first Firstly and foremostly, try to fix them internally. We go back to this ayah of the Holy Quran, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends divine love and mercy in the hearts of the husband and of the wife. Someone says, how come I always get into an argument with my spouse? And all the time I'm fighting with my spouse. Yes. Anyone who says that they've never gotten into an argument with their spouse, you are lying. I don't believe you. No one believes you. It's normal to get into arguments. It's fine. It's normal. It's natural. At the end of the day, if we remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed love and mercy within our hearts, which sometimes is just a lot more difficult to illuminate. It's a lot more difficult to sort of rip that out of our hearts and our souls because they get suppressed by anger and they get suppressed by vice. And thus it's really, really vital to understand that it is there deep down, but whether or not we choose to emphasize it or emanate it, that's up to us. And that requires a lot of work. And that requires a lot of effort. There was a lot of other contemporary problems that I wanted to mention, but a couple in specific, and then I'll move on to the next point of my conversation, specifically in regards to a couple of emails that I've received in the last couple of weeks. One of them was from a young sister who reached out to me, who told me that her father physically abuses her. And now you know that these issues around domestic abuse and violence don't only occur between spouses. But where it becomes so awful and so tragic and so problematic is that this young lady, she reached out to me and she said that my father abuses me. I said, where do you live? She says, I live in a different part of the country. I don't want to say it right now. I said, how can I help you? She said, I don't know. I said, you should go to your local community, see how you can be helpful. She said, no one's going to believe me. Where can I go? Amongst those reasons why we have these contemporary problems within our society is many a time because we don't have the outlets and the mechanisms ready for individuals to go to, or because they don't know where to turn. My dear sisters and brothers, we need to be that outlet. We need to be that mechanism. If no one else is building out those resources, then we have to build out those resources. Another sister reached out and she says that I got divorced at a very young age and no one wants to marry me anymore. She says, is there any outlet? Is there any institution? Is there any organization within our community? I said, I don't know. And she said, what are we going to do? She said, who's going to help me? She said, I have a small daughter. I said, I don't know. I said, but I promise to you that I will make the call at the very least for our community in the name of Abi Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. You, my dear sisters and brothers, have the talent and have the wisdom and have the sort of know-how. You do not need to wait for instruction if you feel that there's a gap within the community, that we can be that change. You can be the one to make that difference. Don't feel like you need to wait for someone else. Together, we can build the support systems for individuals who need them. There's not enough avenues. There's not enough shelters. There's not enough clinics. There are not enough resources. There will never, ever be enough. When we have the messenger of God and we have his family, alayhi salatu wasalam, and literally during the course of these days of Muharram, we weep and we grieve over the tragedy of Zainab alayhi salam, who we know was abused in the way that she was, salamullah alayha. Why can't we build the institutions in her name? Why can't we go out and serve humanity and create those outlets in the name of Imam al-Hussein, salamullah alayhi? In the name of Sayyidah Ruqayya, the daughter of Hussein alayhi salam. We're talking about a daughter who's abused by her father. For our daughter's sake, why don't we name an institution after Sayyidah Sukaina, Sayyidah Ruqayya, peace and blessing be upon the daughters of Hussein alayhi salam. We have that potential. Don't think that we don't. But it's up to us to sort of muster up that conviction and understand that we can be that outlet to make a difference in these communities, to be the difference that this world so desperately needs. And that brings me then to the third dimension of my discussion, in regards to some important points to consider in order to build a successful relationship. Firstly and foremostly, I'll just mention a couple. I have 5 or 6, but we'll try to wrap it up very quickly, inshallah ta'ala. Firstly and foremostly, to lower expectations about one another. Again, when you go back to that narration from Imam Ali alayhi salam, it says, خَالَةُ النَّاسِ مُخَالَطَةً إِن مِتُّم مَّعَهَا بَكَوْا عَلَيْكُمْ. That live in such a way that if you were to die, that the people would grieve over you. Of course, we all want to live a life that resembles the life of the Messenger of God, resemble the life of Ali. If we're a woman, we see examples like that of Zahra and of Zainab alayhi salam. And of course, even men can take examples from these personalities. Even women can take examples from that of the Messenger of God and from Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. But just for the sake of this example, many times we always talk about resembling or sort of walking in the footsteps of Ali and Fatima, of Rasulullah Muhammad and Khadija in terms of their marital relationship. For instance, if you want to marry a Khadija or marry a Fatima al-Zahra, then you have to be the Messenger of God. You have to be Ali ibn Abi Talib. You have to emanate their character and their charisma and their personality and their characteristics if you want a spouse like that, and vice versa, naturally. Similarly, when it comes to relationships, if you want to illuminate a relationship between brother and sister like that of Zainab and Al-Abbas, peace and blessings be upon them, salamullah alayhim, then at the end of the day, you need to understand what loyalty is like. You need to understand what friendship is like. You need to understand what altruism is like. You need to understand what patience is like. You need to actually live those qualities. Because we know that that takes time toward getting to and building to. It's okay to just lower your expectations of one another once in a while. You can't demand everything if you are not everything. And we have to work toward being everything, following what I'm saying. It takes time. And if you start demanding too much from your partner, from your spouse, from your parents, from your children, from your roommates, from anyone that you engage in a relationship with, you're often going to be destined for an unsuccessful relationship with that person. So when we lower expectations and don't always assume that they are going to be sort of 100% on their A game, especially in light of the way that we are living life today, where we're consistently at home and there's a lot of stresses and obstacles, then we're going to sort of be a lot better off. Because when we lower expectations, there's more opportunity to be merciful. There's more opportunity to be compassionate. There's more opportunity to be caring and loving and so on. Number 2, understand that communication itself is a process. Number 1, again, lower expectations. Number 2, understand that communication itself is a process. I mentioned to you before that the greatest and the largest and the most significant problem that we see is an inability to communicate, but at the same time, to understand that this is also the way that we live. We live in a world of social media. We live in a world where we do text consistently and we send emails all the time. That's often how we reach out to people and how people reach out to us. That our conversations are very, very short. They're over a FaceTime call or a quick phone call. Most people, they prefer not to talk on the phone because of how busy our lives tend to get. Text message is a lot more convenient. So understand that, yes, communication face-to-face, eye-to-eye is very important. And being very open and being very emotional and telling one another how you feel is vital as well. But it's not going to happen overnight. And also understand, in addition to this, that everyone else is different. Meaning that everyone is different than you. Sometimes people are more emotional. They're more willing to communicate. And others, on the flip side, they're not willing to communicate and open up so much. So step number 2, in addition to number 1, like I said before, lowering expectations. Number 2, build your verbal communication. Recognize that it takes time. Thirdly, to understand that the best way to get someone to listen is to listen to them. Listen. if you go to someone and you ask them how their day was, and you don't interrupt them, but you keep on asking them, tell me, give a little bit more detail. When someone finally opens themselves up, opens their hearts up to whatever it is that is bothering them, that they're feeling really good about, they're feeling really anxious or stressful about, there's a lot more of an opportunity for them then to listen to you. Naturally, when you talk to your friend, you talk to your spouse, you talk to your brother, your sister, whoever that you might sort of share sort of, unique thoughts to and sort of the depths of your hearts to. When you hear them talk about their obstacles or their challenges or how their day went or about what is stressing them out, they will be that much more inclined to lend their ear to you. What we often call, within the world of chaplaincy, radical listening. To listen consistently 80% of the time and to do talking 20% of the time. I know I've given this example before, but many times people, they come into my office, make an appointment with me to talk about a challenge from amongst their different unique challenges. And I sit in this 45-minute meeting and I ask them, how can I help you? And during the course of the 45 minutes, they're speaking for 40 minutes and I'm listening for 5. And I'm speaking for 5 minutes. And at the end of the conversation, they say, Sheikh Faiyaz, that was amazing. Sheikhna, like you saved my life. You did everything for me. I said, no, man, I didn't do anything for you. All I did was say yes, no, maybe, okay, great, I'm sorry. But the 40 minutes you were speaking, sometimes understand and know that people, they just need to sort of talk their heart out. And when someone listens to them, radical listening means listening actively, means listening attentively, not listening while you're on Instagram saying, or tweeting, oh my God, this person sitting in front of me is so annoying. No, man. Actually open up your heart to when they are talking and when they are communicating and when they are speaking about their obstacles or about their challenges, about what they are going through during the course of their life. When they do that, it goes 2 ways. They will be that much more inclined toward listening to you. If you don't believe me, go home and try it. Of course, you're all home, so try it. Fourthly and finally, amongst those things that we need to do in order to truly build out a successful relationship is to apologize, seek forgiveness. Once in a while when we make mistakes, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, even though it's hard, even though it's difficult, even though it shatters your pride sometimes, even though it might take you some time, say sorry once in a while. It really makes things a lot better. And on this night of Muharram, we want to recollect the story and the anecdote of that man who sought forgiveness from Imam al-Hussein, who also sought to apologize for that which he did to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, amongst the most emotional anecdotes from amongst these anecdotes that we narrate about Ashura and about al-Hussein alayhi salam is the story of Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyahi. Like you all know, Hur al-Riyahi is amongst the generals of the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, and amongst the most chivalrous and courageous men of Kufa. And Hur al-Riyahi, his story is one which really shatters our hearts because we realize and we recognize that so much of his action, so much of his behavior resembles us, of course in a very different way, but nonetheless we take inspiration from this particular anecdote. But before we get into exactly what happened on the morning of the 10th of Muharram, who is Hur al-Riyahi? And what led him toward that change of heart on the day of Ashura? See, my dear sisters and brothers, Hur al-Riyahi, like I mentioned to you earlier, was amongst the most chivalrous and amongst the most important military commanders of the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, sent by Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad from Kufa. He was sent with one responsibility and one task, and that was to intercept the caravan of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam at a small town called Sharaf, nearby this area, which was known to be a very mountainous area in between Mecca and Kufa. As I mentioned to you all last night, that Imam al-Hussein والسلام, he directs himself after Mecca toward going to Kufa. We know that Muslim ibn Aqil was killed, but what drove him eventually toward Karbala was the fact that even though he had made his intention to go and ride toward Kufa, Hur al-Riyahi and his caravan, his military, they intercepted the caravan of Abi Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. He alights from his horse and he goes to Imam al-Hussein salamullah alayhi, and he says, "Oh Aba Abdullah, oh Aba Abdullah," he says that I have been sent to perform a task. He said, "What's that task?" He says that, "Oh Aba Abdullah, you have either one of two choices. Either you pledge allegiance to Yazid ibn Muawiyah, and I send a message to Kufa, and then from Kufa to Damascus that you've done so, or I have to bring your head to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad." At this moment, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he looks at Hur al-Riyahi, and he utters this line. He states, "Thaqalatka ummuka ya Hur." He states, "May your mother grieve over you," in a way to virtually insult Hur. It's not really the way that the Imams of Ahl al-Bayt would speak, but sometimes it was necessary. He states, "Thaqalatka ummuka ya Hur." May your mother grieve over you. You know what Hur's response to Imam al-Hussein was? Narrated in Abi Mikhnaf, he says that I am from the community of the Arabs, and if anyone else were to speak those words to me, I would have responded a lot harsher. But Hussein, your mother is Fatima al-Zahra. How could I say anything poorly about her? At this moment, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he tells his companions to go and take water and to give it to the army of Hur al-Riyahi, subhanallah. And he says, and go and take water and go and wash the horses of Hur because they've come from Kufa. And it was really hot that day in the, imagine the heat of the desert of Arabia. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam, he gives water toward the enemy who was ready to shed his blood, and he even gives water to the horses, which only a few days later trample over his sacred body. Salamullah alayhi. That water that he gives to the enemies on this day, my dear sisters and brothers, those of you who know the story of Karbala, how beneficial would it have been to Imam Hussein on the 10th of Muharram? So firstly, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam has this interaction when Hur, he realizes that this is the son of Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. And look how generous he is that he's giving us and even our horses water in the heat of Arabia. Number one. The second thing that happened, which really shook the heart of Hur al-Riyahi, was that it was the time for the Dhuhr prayers. But it was a time for the Dhuhr prayers, and Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam ordered someone to recite the Adhan, and then Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam went to Hur and he said, "Oh Hur, you go lead prayers on that side of the desert, and I will lead my companions and my family members and my army over here." To which Hur says, "Ya Aba Abdullah, you are the grandson of the Messenger of God. We'll all pray behind you." Again, he knows in his heart that that's Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, that Sayyid Shabab Ahl al-Jannah. This is the leader of the youth of paradise. Who am I to lead prayers when Hussein is here? Hur al-Riyahi, he performs those prayers behind Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. At the time of Asr, again the Adhan is called out. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam again leads prayers. Hur al-Riyahi, he prays behind Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam again. Immediately after the Asr prayers on that day, he gathered together his caravan, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and he starts to move toward Kufa. At that moment, Hur al-Riyahi again steps in front of him. He says, "Yo, Aba Abdullah, where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to Kufa. Do you not know about the 18,000 letters of the people that they wrote?" He says, "I have to go." To which Hur he says to Abu Abdullah, he says, oh Imam al-Hussein, I can't let you do that. You will follow me. And it's stated that during the course of those days, Imam al-Hussein والسلام, was then taken toward the barren land of Karbala only a few days later. Of course, the scheme was such that Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad from Kufa, the army from Damascus of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, would all take Imam al-Hussein السلام, his family members, his children, into that valley alone, far away from his supporters, so that they could be massacred in the way they were. Salamullah. And on the 10th of Muharram, Hur al-Riyahi, he looks at his contingency of the army. He sees the 30,000 from the army of Umar bin Sa'd around him. And then he gazes across and he sees the children of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. He sees the women of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, the granddaughters of the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And it is said that he goes to Umar bin Sa'd and he says, oh Umar bin Sa'd, are we really going to kill them? That's the grandson of the Messenger of God. Are we really going to shed their blood? Umar bin Sa'd, he says, oh Hur, in a few hours there will be heads that are rolling around these plains of Karbala. Of course we are going to kill them. At that moment, Hur al-Riyahi, he goes back and he stands in front of the middle of the battlefield. This is prior toward the beginning of battle. And he gazes at the tents of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, perhaps seeing the light illuminating and the recitation of ayat of the Holy Quran emanating. And one of his companions comes to him and says, oh Hur, if someone were to ask me about the most courageous of the swordsmen and of the people of Kufa, by God, no one, I would say, is more courageous or more brave than you. He says, yet why do I see you in this state right now? Hur, he looks toward that man, the man by the name of Qais, and he says, oh Qais, he says, have you given water to your horses today? He says, not yet. In his mind, I don't know why Hur asked that question, but many speculate that perhaps Hur was wondering and he was asking that man that we have water to give to our horses, but Hussein does not have water to give to his children. And it is said that he covers his head and he gets on top of his horse and he begins to ride closer and closer toward Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam's tents. When all of a sudden that man who was standing next to Hur before and asked him those questions, he says that I thought that Hur went to go and use the restroom. I have no idea why he was walking in that direction. And he said, if I knew that he was going to support Imam al-Hussein, I would have even gone. In what way? Hur al-Riyahi, imagine yourselves, my dear sisters and brothers, we're all sinners. We've all made mistakes. We've all had lapses during the course of our lives. Imagine in what way we would humble ourselves to say the shahada to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. He said that he covers his face, he lowers his neck, in a way to humble himself in front of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And he enters and he stands, on top of his horse, he enters into the company of the tents of Abu Abdullah. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he exits from the tent and he says, Ma ismuka man ant, who are you? That man doesn't respond, Hur doesn't respond. A second time he says, Ya rajul man ant, who are you? He did not respond. A third time he says, Ma ismuka, what is your name? To which he calls out, Ya Aba Abdullah, ana alladhi ja'a bik minat. Oh Aba Abdullah, I am the one who intercepted your caravan. Oh Aba Abdullah, I am the one who took you away from your destination. Oh Aba Abdullah, I am the one who is leading to your eventual martyrdom. Oh Aba Abdullah, I am the one who is orphaning your wives. I am the one who is widowing your wives. I am the one who is orphaning your children. Halli min tawba ya Aba Abdullah. Is there forgiveness for me? I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that to you, Abba. Please forgive me. At this moment, again, Imam al-Hussein says, Man ismuka. He removes his helmet. He looks at Abu Abdullah with tears in his eyes. He says, Oh, my master Hussein, Ana Hur bin Yazid al-Riyahi. I am the one who did all of this to you. Is there an opportunity for me to be forgiven? To which Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam says, Oh, Hur, if you seek forgiveness from God, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive you. He says, Oh Abu Abdullah, then please allow for me to be amongst the first ones to go out and fight, because I am the one who is responsible for bringing you here. So it is said that Hur al-Riyahi, he goes out, he recites some lines of poetry, he fights valiantly, he kills some of the enemy until he is struck on top of the head, and he makes that call, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, out of his mercy, out of his generosity, out of his compassion, he rushes to this man, he takes his head, he puts it on his lap, and he caresses his beard. And this man says, "Oh, Aba Abdullah, are you sure that Allah has forgiven me? Are you sure that your grandfather, the messenger of God, has forgiven me?" At this moment, Imam al-Hussein says, "Anta hurrun kama samatka ummuk," that, "Oh Hur, know that you are free just in the same way that your mother has named you. Surely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven you. But I ask you, oh my dear sisters and brothers, this was the compassion, this was the mercy, this was the love emanated by Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, even to a man who committed that sort of atrocity. What compassion and what mercy and what forgiveness, what sort of love did anyone demonstrate to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam's children only a few hours later on the day of Ashura? We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for our lives to resemble the lives of Muhammad and Muhammad, and for our death to resemble the death of Muhammad and Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for us to illuminate and manifest the characteristics, the charisma, the personality of the Prophet and his family, alayhi salatu wasalam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for our hearts to illuminate with their love and with their compassion, with their justice and with their generosity and with their mercy. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for our relationships to be a mechanism and a means by which we draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of those individuals who are going through obstacles and challenges in their families and their relationships, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove them and give them a life of ease. Barahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyina Muhammad wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin.